How do I get the required certificates of clearance for a purchase of real estate in Brazil? Hello there, my name is Luciano Oliveira. I am a Brazilian attorney. So the certificates of clearance are known in Portuguese as certidões negativas, and they basically address the main obligations of a seller in a real estate transaction. They are going to address things such as if the taxes on the property are paid to date. They are going to address if the seller's income tax and other types of tax obligations are taken care. They are also gonna say if the seller has, for instance, labor issues, which in Brazil are something considered very serious, and other aspects of the transaction that are addressed in order to reduce the buyer's risk. So the idea is the certificates of clearance are gonna bring some peace of mind to the seller. However, it is important for you to note that the certificates of clearance, they are the bare minimum when it comes to due diligence. This is because the cartorios, the registries, they are gonna just ask what it is in the list of certificates of clearance. Let me give you an example of something that they're not gonna ask. Let's say if the seller, a private seller, has a company and this company has a lot of labor debt. Although the labor debt for the company is not gonna show on the certificates of clearance, if the seller sells a property, the people entitled to the labor benefits that were not paid by the company owned by the seller, they can go after the property that the seller sold later on. In other words, even though there is a closing and the property is transferred to your name, people who have rights against the seller's company, they may find out about the transaction and come after you as the buyer later on. So these more advanced check-ins, they are not going to be done by the registry, and most of the time the realtors are not going to be paying attention to them. Only attorneys specializing in real estate transactions are usually capable of identifying these other points of risk and doing the due diligence steps required to make sure that you have all the bases covered. Where do I get the so-called certificates of clearance? So the good news is, at least for the basic ones, for the required ones by the registry, the seller's realtor is going to do the legwork and present certificates. Now, important for you to note, if a certificate of clearance comes with some type of issue, like let's say the seller is not up to date with the federal taxes, the certificate of clearance is going to come with a warning like this person has an issue, or the certificate of clearance was not issued for some reason that's not stated on the certificate itself. If that's the case, your realtor may choose to simply say nothing about it and let the transaction go, because the registry is asking for the certificate of clearance. But if the certificate of clearance comes bad, the registry may still let the transaction go as long as the buyer represents that the buyer is assuming the risk for such unpaid tax on the seller side. In other words, all the certificates of clearance are required, but if the seller for some reason is unable to provide such certificate of clearance, the registry may still let the transaction happen at your own risk. And because of the language barrier, because of the interest that the realtor has in this transaction going through, it may happen, and we saw that happening unfortunately multiple times. The realtor is not going to tell you anything and you're just going to show up on the day of the closing. Maybe the registry officer is going to notice that you're there and he's going to say, oh, there was a certificate that was not showing the clearance, and the realtor is going to say, oh, don't worry about it, that's something minor, as long as you sign here, you are the owner. So at that moment in time, you're not going to back off, you're just going to go along with the flow, and you may be incurring a high risk because of the effective certificate of clearance. So that's why our recommendation is that you secure an attorney. If not for the entire transaction, you secure an attorney for at least the key points in the transaction, such as drafting the contract, reviewing the records, reviewing the certificates of clearance, reviewing the transfer deed before you sign it, and making sure that a final deed is issued. In terms of due diligence, some of the additional steps that you may take or you may ask your attorney to take on your behalf are getting a credit check on the sellers. If the seller has other issues not identified in the certificates of clearance, they may well show on the credit report for the sellers. For instance, if they are issuing bad checks, if they have outstanding debt that's not showing in the certificates of clearance yet, because it takes some time between the debt occurring and the debt becoming a lawsuit to show up on the certificates. So the credit report may be a valid tool to help you understand the full picture about the sellers. Just like the credit report, there are other sources. For instance, you may ask your attorney to do a check, a search for lawsuits. Again, maybe there is a very serious lawsuit going on, but because it's a fresh lawsuit, it's not being reflected on the certificates of clearance. These are just two examples. There are many other sources that may be used for a due diligence, and it's going to all depend on how comfortable you are with the transaction, how much risk you are willing to take, and your personality as well, in terms of covering every single base or accepting some wiggle room and letting the transaction flow. I hope this information was helpful. If it was helpful, please like our video so other people can find it, and follow us for more tips.